hadn't seen my mother's face in 5 years. Not once, not even through a screen. When I walked into the reception hall in my sister's wedding and found her standing directly in my path, wine glass in hand, wearing the specific expression I remembered from childhood. The one she wore right before delivering a verdict. "Amara," she said, my name landing strangely in the air after half a decade of silence. "You actually came." Part 1. A family built around one profession. My name is Amara, and I grew up in a household in Houston, Texas, where medicine wasn't simply a career path some family members happened to pursue. It was the organizing principle of our entire family identity, spanning 3 generations by the time I came of age. My grandfather, Dr. Emeka Okafor, had immigrated from Nigeria in 1978 to complete his medical residency, eventually building a respected cardiology practice that anchored our extended family's sense of itself for decades. My father, Dr. Chidi Okafor, followed directly in that path, becoming a well-regarded orthopedic surgeon. My mother, Dr. Ngozi Okafor, practiced as an OB-GYN. My older brother, Kelechi, completed his residency in neurology in 2016. And my younger sister, Ifeoma, the bride at the wedding where this story's central confrontation takes place, had, by the time of her wedding in 2024, just finished her own residency in pediatrics. I was the singular exception in 3 generations of a family that had built its entire self-understanding around the specific prestige, discipline, and social standing that medicine conferred within our community. From a remarkably young age, I remember this expectation being explicit by the time I was perhaps 8 or 9. It was simply assumed, discussed openly at family gatherings, that all 3 Okafor children would eventually become physicians, continuing an unbroken family lineage that my grandfather had begun nearly 5 decades earlier. I followed that expected path for longer than I now, in retrospect, think was genuinely honest of me. I completed a pre-med undergraduate degree at Rice University, graduating in 2015, and was accepted into medical school at the University of Texas Southwestern, beginning my studies that same year with what I told myself, and what my family certainly believed, was genuine commitment to the same profession that defined everyone else in our household. Part 2. The decision that broke everything. I want to be honest about the specific timeline of my growing disillusionment with medicine, because I think it matters for understanding how genuinely difficult the eventual decision was, rather than some impulsive abandonment of a path I'd never actually wanted. By my second year of medical school, in 2016, I had begun experiencing a genuine, deepening crisis about whether I actually wanted this specific career, as opposed to simply having absorbed, since childhood, an assumption about what my life was supposed to look like without ever fully examining whether it matched who I actually was or what I actually wanted to spend my working life doing. I found myself, during that period, increasingly drawn to a very different field entirely: architecture, a passion I'd nurtured privately, almost secretly since high school, sketching building designs in the margins of my pre-med coursework, a fact I'd never shared with my family because it had simply never seemed like a legitimate alternative worth mentioning. I completed my second year of medical school while quietly, privately researching architecture programs, uncertain whether I had the courage to actually act on what felt, at the time, like an almost unthinkable deviation from everything my family understood about who I was supposed to become. In the spring of 2017, after considerable private turmoil, and eventually a series of conversations with a therapist I'd begun seeing specifically to work through this crisis, I made the decision that would ultimately cost me my relationship with most of my family for the following 5 years. I withdrew from medical school and enrolled, that same fall, in a graduate architecture program at the University of Texas at Austin. I told my parents directly, in person, during a visit home in June 2017, choosing to deliver the news face-to-face rather than over the phone, believing, naively in retrospect, that the courage of an in-person conversation might soften what I already suspected would be a devastating reaction. It did not soften anything. My father's reaction was a mixture of genuine bewilderment and mounting anger, escalating over the course of that conversation into something considerably harsher than I had prepared myself for. My mother's reaction, in some ways, hurt considerably more, not anger initially, but a kind of quiet, devastated grief, as though I had announced not simply a career change, but the death of a version of her daughter she had spent over 2 decades constructing in her own mind. Part 3. The estrangement. The following months unfolded into what became, ultimately, a 5-year estrangement from most of my immediate family. Not a single, dramatic severing, but a gradual, accumulating distance that hardened over time into something considerably more permanent than any of us, I suspect, initially anticipated. My father, in the weeks following my announcement, made his position explicit in a conversation I've never fully forgotten. He told me directly that as far as he was concerned, I had thrown away, not just my own future, but the specific legacy our family had built across 3 generations, and that he could not, in good conscience, continue financially supporting a path he considered a genuine betrayal of everything our family stood for. This wasn't simply rhetorical. My parents had been covering a substantial portion of my educational expenses, support that was withdrawn entirely, and immediately once I confirmed my decision to leave medical school. My mother's estrangement unfolded more slowly, and in its own way, more painfully. Not a clean break, but a gradual withdrawal, phone calls becoming less frequent, then stopping almost entirely by the following year, family gatherings I was no longer invited to. A silence that grew, over subsequent years, into something neither of us ever directly addressed or formally ended, simply allowed to calcify into the default state of our relationship. My brother Kelechi, deep in his own demanding neurology residency during this period, largely stayed neutral, maintaining occasional, careful contact with me while avoiding direct conflict with our parents about the situation. My sister Ifoma, 6 years younger than me and still in college when I made my decision, maintained the most consistent relationship with me throughout the estrangement. Quiet, occasional texts, a birthday call each year, small gestures of connection that never fully bridged the larger family rupture, but that meant, to me, considerably more than she likely realized during those difficult years. Part 4. Building a different life. I want to spend some time on what those 5 years actually contained for me, because I think it matters for understanding the specific weight of standing in that reception hall, facing my mother, half a decade later. I completed my architecture degree in 2019, graduating with genuine distinction, and joined a mid-sized firm in Austin specializing in sustainable residential and community design. Work that felt, from nearly the first month, considerably more aligned with who I actually was than the medical path I'd abandoned 2 years earlier ever had, despite years of genuinely trying to make that earlier path work. By 2022, I had been promoted to project lead, overseeing a significant affordable housing development that would eventually win a regional design award the following year. The kind of professional milestone that, under different family circumstances, might have been celebrated at exactly the kind of gathering where our family typically marked significant achievements, but that had, instead, passed entirely unmentioned within my immediate family, since we were, by that point, barely speaking at all. I built, during those 5 years, a life I genuinely valued, meaningful work, a small circle of close friends who'd become something like chosen family, a serious relationship with a man named Julian, a structural engineer I'd met through a shared project in 2021, whom I'd been living with for nearly 2 years by the time of my sister's wedding. I want to be honest that this period, despite the genuine pain of family estrangement running underneath it, was not simply a story of loss. It was also, unmistakably, a period of real growth, real accomplishment, and a kind of authentic self-understanding I don't believe I would have found had I continued along the path my family had mapped out for me since childhood. Part 5. The Wedding Invitation. Ifoma's wedding invitation arrived in March 2024, addressed specifically to me and to Julian, whom she'd met and genuinely liked during the 2 occasions we'd managed to see each other privately over the preceding years. The invitation itself carried enormous weight, given everything it implied, not simply an invitation to a family event, but potentially my first opportunity in 5 years to be in the same room as my parents and brother, since the estrangement had fully hardened. I called Ifoma directly after receiving it, wanting to understand exactly what to expect. "I want you there," she told me plainly. "This is my wedding, and you're my sister, and I've spent 5 years watching this family stay broken over something I've never fully understood or agreed with. I've told Mom and Dad you're invited, and that I expect them to be civil, whatever their feelings are. I can't promise you a warm reunion, Amara. But I can promise you a seat, and I can promise I actually want you there." I decided, after considerable deliberation with Julian and with my therapist, whom I'd continued seeing intermittently over the years, that I would attend. Not because I expected reconciliation, but because I refused to let 5 years of estrangement cost me the chance to witness my younger sister's wedding, an event I genuinely wanted to be part of regardless of the complicated family dynamics surrounding it. Part 6, The Confrontation. I arrived at the reception hall in Houston that October afternoon in 2024, considerably more anxious than I'd expected to feel given how much time I'd spent mentally preparing for this moment. Julian's hand in mine provided a steadiness I was genuinely grateful for as we walked in, scanning the room for familiar faces I hadn't seen in half a decade. My mother found me first, standing directly in my path near the entrance, wine glass in hand, wearing an expression I remembered clearly from childhood. The specific, measured look she wore right before delivering some kind of verdict. "Amara," she said, "you actually came." I felt my chest tighten, uncertain in that first moment, exactly what direction this conversation was about to take. "Ifoma invited me," I said carefully. "She wanted me here." My mother was quiet for a long moment, studying me in a way that felt both familiar and, after 5 years apart, strange and unfamiliar all at once. When she finally spoke again, what she said was not what I had braced myself to hear. "I saw the article," she said, "about your housing project, the one that won the regional award last year. Your Aunt Kioma sent it to me actually months ago. I've read it probably a dozen times since." I stood there, genuinely stunned, uncertain how to respond to this specific, unexpected direction. "You never said anything," I said finally. "I didn't know you'd even seen it." "I didn't know how to say anything," my mother said, and I watched something shift in her composed expression, something considerably more vulnerable than the measured, judgmental look she'd worn when I first walked in. 5 years is a long time to maintain a position, Amara, even one I've genuinely believed in. And I want to be honest with you, I did believe in it for a long time. I believed you'd made a genuine mistake, throwing away something your father and I and your grandfather built across decades. I believed, for years, that eventually you'd realize that and come back to it. "I'm not coming back to it," I said, as gently but as clearly as I could manage. "I need you to understand that clearly, whatever else happens today, architecture isn't a phase I'm working through. It's who I actually am in a way medicine never was, no matter how much I tried to make it fit." Part 7, What My Mother Actually Said. Here is what my mother said next, the sentence that, more than anything else in that entire difficult reunion, I have carried with me since. "I know," she said. "I think I've known that for a while now, if I'm honest with myself. What I've been struggling with isn't really whether your path is legitimate, Amara. It's whether I can find a way to be proud of a path I never understood or chose for you, without feeling like I'm somehow betraying the family legacy I've spent my whole life believing mattered more than anything else. I've spent 5 years choosing that legacy over my own daughter, and standing here today, watching you walk in with someone who clearly loves you, having built an entire successful, meaningful life I know almost nothing about. I think I finally understand how much that choice has actually cost me, not just you." I felt tears forming, unexpected and immediate, standing in the middle of a wedding reception hall I hadn't anticipated becoming the site of this particular reckoning. "Mom," I said, "I needed you to say that 5 years ago. I needed it considerably more than I need it today, if I'm honest. But I'm genuinely glad you're saying it now." Rather than never. Part 8, the rest of that evening. The remainder of Ifoma's wedding, did not unfold into some seamless, immediate family reconciliation. 5 years of accumulated distance doesn't dissolve in the span of a single conversation, however significant that conversation feels in the moment. My father remained considerably more guarded throughout the evening, offering a stiff, uncertain greeting rather than anything approaching the vulnerability my mother had shown. Though he did, notably, shake Julian's hand and ask a handful of genuine, if awkward, questions about my work. The first direct engagement with my career he'd offered in 5 years. Kelechi, my brother, found me during the reception and offered what felt like the most straightforwardly warm welcome of the entire evening, hugging me tightly and telling me, without any of the complicated hedging our parents' reactions carried, that he'd missed me and was genuinely glad I'd come. Ifoma, radiant in her wedding dress, found a quiet moment during the reception to pull me aside and tell me how much it meant that I'd actually shown up, how she'd genuinely worried, in the weeks leading up to the wedding, that the accumulated family tension might keep me away entirely. "I'm proud of you," she told me. "I've always been proud of you, even when I didn't fully understand the decision. I just wish this family had figured out how to say that a lot sooner." Epilogue. It has been just over a year since that October wedding, and my relationship with my parents, while still genuinely complicated, has moved into a considerably more honest place than the 5 years of near-total estrangement that preceded it. My mother and I speak regularly now, rebuilding, gradually, a relationship that will likely never fully return to what it was before my decision to leave medical school. But that has become, in its own way, more honest than what existed even before the estrangement, built now on actual mutual understanding rather than the unexamined assumption that had shaped so much of our relationship for the first 25 years of my life. My father's relationship with me has healed more slowly, and I want to be honest that it remains, even now, somewhat guarded. A father who has, I believe, genuinely begun reconsidering the rigid framework he built his entire sense of family legacy around, but who has not yet found, or perhaps allowed himself, the same vulnerability my mother offered that day in the reception hall. I completed a second major project this past spring, a community center design that, unlike my earlier housing project, my parents actually attended the opening ceremony for, standing, somewhat awkwardly but genuinely, among my professional colleagues, listening to remarks about work I'd built entirely outside the specific legacy they'd once believed was the only legitimate path available to their children. I think often about that specific moment in the reception hall, my mother's face after 5 years of silence, the particular vulnerability in her admission that our family's rigid definition of legitimate success had cost her something significant, even as she'd spent years believing she was protecting something worth protecting. I think about how close that conversation came to never happening at all, how easily 5 years of estrangement might simply have calcified into a permanent, unaddressed rupture, had Afoma not insisted, clearly and without hedging, that I belonged in that room regardless of how complicated my presence there might feel to everyone else. Family, I've come to understand more clearly over this past year, isn't always built through unbroken agreement about what a legitimate life looks like. Sometimes it's built, instead, through the harder, more honest work of finally admitting, even 5 years too late, that love and pride can exist alongside genuine confusion and disagreement, and that the alternative, an entire family calcifying into permanent silence rather than doing that harder work, costs everyone considerably more than any single difference of opinion about which path a life should take. In the end,